Bruce Lee cannot breathe. 210 pounds of grown man is folded across his chest. A forearm is wedged under his jaw. The floor under his shoulder blades is cold, hard, and real. His right arm is pinned flat. His left hand claws once, uselessly, at a wrist thick as a table leg. Somewhere above him, a stopwatch clicks. He does not fight it. That's the part that should stop you. A man who can put his fist through 6 inches of pine before you finish blinking is lying under another man's weight, and he is not fighting it. His eyes are open. His breathing is slow, almost bored, like a man waiting for a bus that's a little late. Here's the version they tell in the back rooms of old dojos, the one that outlived every man who was actually in that room. They say Bruce Lee once let himself be pinned to a floor by a man he could have put down in 4 seconds. And he did it on purpose, 3 days before he needed a city full of strangers to believe the opposite was true. I can't prove that's exactly how it happened. Nobody can. Stay with me anyway, because the reason this story keeps getting retold has almost nothing to do with whether that elbow was ever real, and everything to do with what it was practiced for. The man on top of him is named Curtis Boyle, a stocky brown belt, built like a fire hydrant, the kind of student every school has one of, strong enough to make the black belts sweat and slow enough that they usually don't have to. He has Bruce completely controlled. He knows it. He is grinning about it. The specific grin of a man who has waited 2 years for this exact moment and intends to enjoy every second of it. 41 seconds, a voice calls from the doorway, flat, unimpressed, reading off a stopwatch. Bruce taps the mat twice with his free hand. Curtis lets go like he's been burned, scrambling back, already halfway into an apology. Bruce sits up slowly, rolls his neck, and laughs, a real laugh, short and low, the kind you only hear from a man who is not remotely embarrassed. Again, Bruce says. Curtis blinks. You want me to again? Again, and this time don't ease up at the end. You eased up. Here's what you need to understand about this room. It's a converted storage space above a Chinatown herbalist shop, maybe 18 feet by 24, mirrors on one wall, a wooden dummy in the corner, missing an arm nobody's gotten around to fixing. It's 9 in the evening. There are 4 people in it who matter to this story, and one stopwatch that matters more than any of them. And the man everyone in this city will soon be calling unbeatable has just asked for the 3rd time tonight to be pinned to the floor again. Nobody in that room knows why yet. In 3 days, a lot of people are going to find out at once, in a room bigger than this one, in front of more witnesses than Bruce has ever performed for in his life. But tonight, this is just training. Whatever it's training for hasn't happened yet. This is how it began. 3 days out. That's the number that matters here. Not the crowd that's coming, not the 10 strangers who haven't been found yet, not the newspaper that set the whole thing in motion. 3 days, and Bruce Lee is spending them getting thrown. Curtis sets up again, wider stance this time, careful the way you're careful with something you don't fully understand. Across the room, a second student, younger, wiry, still working on his stripes, watches with his arms crossed, the posture of someone deeply unsure whether what he's seeing is genius or something closer to self-punishment. He's not sparring. The younger man says quietly to no one. He's rehearsing losing. That's exactly what he's doing. And the reason takes us back further than 3 days, back to a demonstration in front of 200 people, a newspaperman with a notebook and a bad idea for a headline, and 6 words that are the entire reason any of this is happening. Bruce Lee, can you beat 10 men? He didn't answer it the way anyone expected. He never does. But we're getting ahead of the story, and I promised I'd take you through it properly. Every volunteer, every reason it walked into that room, every piece of it. So let's go back to where it actually starts. Not the floor, the question. 3 days later that floor, 3 days earlier, this exact question in this exact room. And here's what nobody watching Curtis pin him could have known. Bruce was not training to win anything. "You keep asking me to lose faster," Curtis says, catching his breath, sitting cross-legged now, sweat darkening the collar of his GI. "I don't get it. You could break my wrist from this position in about 2 seconds, and we both know it." "I know it," Bruce says. "That's not the point." "Then what's the point?" Bruce stands, rolls his shoulder, walks to the mirror, and looks at himself the way you'd look at a stranger you were trying to size up. "In 3 days," he says, "I'm going to lose. Somewhere in that room, at least once, probably more than once, a stranger is going to get a hand on me that I don't want on me. That's not a guess. That's arithmetic. 10 men, 1 of me. Even if 9 of them are terrible, the 10th doesn't have to be good. He just has to be lucky, and luck doesn't care how many years I've trained." The younger student, the wiry one, still counting his stripes, has stopped pretending not to listen. "So why do it at all?" "Because losing and panicking aren't the same event," Bruce says. "Losing is information. Panicking is what happens when you've never practiced losing and your body doesn't know the difference between a bad position and the end of the world." He looks back at Curtis. "So we practice the bad position over and over until my body stops screaming about it. That's what this is. I'm not learning to beat you. I'm learning what it feels like when I can't, so that in 3 days, when it happens with a stranger in an audience, it feels like Tuesday." Nobody says anything for a moment. Then Curtis, still on the floor, says the thing that ends up being closer to the truth than he realizes. "You're not training for a fight," he says. "You're training for 10 of them, back to back, and you already know you can't win all 10 the normal way." Bruce doesn't answer that directly. He just asks him to set up again. They go 4 more rounds after that, and by the 4th, something in Bruce's body has changed. Not his skill, which was never really in question, but his relationship to the moment right before the floor hits his back. His shoulders stay loose a fraction of a second longer than they did an hour earlier. His breathing doesn't spike the way it did the first time Curtis's forearm found his throat. By the time the 2 of them finally stop, close to midnight, both men are soaked through, and Curtis Boyle, a stocky brown belt who will spend the rest of his life telling people he once pinned Bruce Lee to a mat 7 times in a single evening, which is true, and which he will never once explain the actual purpose of, because Bruce never fully explained it to him either. Sits on the edge of the mat, trying to catch his breath, and watches his teacher smile at the ceiling like a man who has just solved something. That's who Bruce Lee actually was 3 days before the room. A 27-year-old instructor with a small school and a growing name, spending his nights getting thrown on purpose because he'd already done the math on a question most men wouldn't have dared answer honestly, let alone out loud, in front of a reporter with a notebook. Which brings us to the reporter, and the question, and the very ordinary demonstration where none of this was supposed to happen at all. 2.5 weeks earlier, on a Saturday afternoon warm enough that half the crowd was fanning itself with the event program, about 200 people had packed into a community hall a few blocks from Bruce's school. A fundraiser demonstration, folding chairs, a card table doing double duty as a stage. Kids in the front rows because their fathers had dragged them along expecting something like the movies. Bruce Lee was the last act on the bill, and by most accounts, the only one anybody remembered walking out. The hall smelled like floor wax and cigarette smoke drifting in from the sidewalk, and a box fan in the corner did almost nothing against the heat except push warm air from one side of the room to the other. Bruce came out in a plain white t-shirt, sleeves pushed up, and moved through the first few minutes of the demonstration with the loose, unhurried confidence of a man who had done this particular routine so many times that it stopped costing him anything to perform. He'd broken boards. He'd done the 1-inch punch that sent a 200-pound volunteer stumbling backward into a folding chair, which collapsed which got the biggest laugh of the afternoon, a sound that rolled all the way to the back row, where even the kids who'd spent the first 20 minutes squirming in their seats went suddenly completely still. And when it came time for questions, a young newspaperman near the back, notebook out, tie a little too tight for the heat, stood up and asked something that wasn't really a question so much as a dare wearing a question's clothes. His name was Charlie Voss, 24 years old, 3 years out of journalism school, writing for a small sporting paper nobody outside the city had heard of. And what he asked, more or less word for word, according to the two people who still argue about the exact phrasing 40 years later, was this. Mr. Lee, everybody in this room just watched you break a board. I'm sure that's very impressive. But if you're really as good as people say, could you actually beat 10 men? Real men, not volunteers holding boards. The room went quiet in the specific way a room goes quiet when someone's just said something a little rude in public and everyone wants to see what happens next. Bruce didn't get angry. That's the first thing every version of this story agrees on. He didn't even look particularly surprised, the way you don't look surprised at a question you've heard some version of 100 times before from men who wanted to see you flinch. He looked at Charlie Voss for what witnesses remember as a long moment, probably closer to 3 or 4 seconds, though everyone swears it felt longer, and said, 10 is a very specific number. Find me 10 and we'll see. The room laughed, the good kind of laugh, relief mixed with delight, and somebody in the second row started a slow clap that the rest of the hall picked up. Charlie Voss laughed too, a little too loudly, the laugh of a young man who'd gotten more than he bargained for and wasn't sure yet whether that was good news or bad. Here's what gets me about this part of the story. Everyone who tells it assumes Charlie Voss walked into that hall hunting for a headline. The eager young reporter, sniffing out controversy, ready to make a name for himself off another man's discomfort. Almost nobody tells you the part that actually explains what happened next. He wasn't chasing anything. He was following an assignment. 3 days before that demonstration, Charlie Voss had been sitting across a cluttered desk from a man named Walter Kessler, the publisher of the sporting paper Charlie worked for, a heavy-set man in his 50s who chewed on unlit cigars and read circulation numbers the way other men read scripture. Kessler had handed him the assignment sheet for the Chinatown demonstration with a specific instruction clipped to it in his own handwriting. Get him to say something big. Don't come back with he broke a board. Everyone's seen a man break a board. Charlie hadn't wanted to ask the 10-men question. He told a colleague as much on the drive over, and that colleague, a young woman named Halloran who covered the society pages and had opinions about everything, remembered it clearly enough to repeat it years later. He said it felt cheap, she told me. He said, I don't even want to ask it. It's a stunt question. It's the kind of thing you ask a boxer to sell tickets, not a martial artist doing a demonstration for kids. And I told him, Charlie, you don't get to decide that. Kessler decides that. You just get to decide how you ask it. So he asked it exactly the way Kessler wanted it asked. Big, provocative, a little insulting, wrapped just carefully enough in a question mark that nobody could call it an outright challenge. And when Bruce Lee answered it with 6 words instead of laughing it off, Charlie Voss realized, sitting there in a folding chair with his pen frozen over his notebook, that he had just accidentally created the single best story of his career, and that it wasn't really his story at all. It belonged to the man who'd sent him there to get it. That tension, a young reporter caught between an assignment he didn't fully believe in and a story bigger than he knew what to do with, turns out to matter a great deal later on. Hold on to it. We'll come back to it, because it's not a footnote. It's closer to the engine. For now, though, the important thing is simpler. A newspaperman asked a fair question in a room full of witnesses, and Bruce Lee said, find me 10, and several somebodies, as it turned out, had to go do exactly that. Now, The version nobody usually tells is what happens between a challenge like that getting made and a challenge like that actually happening. It sounds simple in hindsight. Find 10 men. How hard could that be? Harder than you'd think, and a great deal stranger. Look at it from Charlie Voss's side for a second, because his paper was the one that had to make good on the dare. Kessler put a small notice in the classifieds. No name attached to it beyond a demonstration of martial skill. A date about 3 weeks out and a line that read, more or less. Wanted 10 volunteers, no experience required. Must be willing to test yourself against a trained fighter. $5 for showing up. 20 if you last. $20 was 3 days' wages for a dock worker in 1967. That number did most of the recruiting by itself. By the second morning, there was an actual line outside the newspaper's side entrance before the office had even opened. A dozen men leaning against the brick, passing a single lit cigarette hand to hand, none of them quite meeting anyone else's eyes. All of them there for reasons they weren't yet ready to say out loud to strangers. The clerk who processed the applications kept a folder for each name, a single index card, occupation and reason both left blank on the printed form. Almost nobody filled in the reason line. They gave it to her out loud instead. If they gave it at all, the way you tell somebody something you're not proud enough of to put your name to in writing. The first man through the door was named Sully, heavy set, forearms like ship's rope, a longshoreman who'd read the notice on a lunch break and walked straight to the paper's offices still in his work clothes. One witness, a clerk who took down names that week, told me what he said almost word for word because it stuck with her. My wife's been sick since spring, he told the clerk. $20 is groceries for 2 weeks. I don't care who I'm fighting. I've unloaded crates heavier than any man alive. That's reason one. Money. Plain, unembarrassed, the kind of reason that doesn't need a story built around it, because it already is one. The second volunteer showed up 2 days later, and he had a very different reason. One he didn't share with the clerk, but did share, years afterward, with a training partner who eventually told it to me. His name was Ortiz, a former judo competitor in his 30s, decent in his day, never quite good enough to make it count for much beyond a small trophy case and a long memory. He'd read a magazine piece about the Chinatown demonstration, the one where Bruce Lee's one-inch punch had gotten more ink than Ortiz's entire competitive career put together, and something about that had curdled in him for 2 weeks straight. I didn't need the money, he told his training partner. I needed somebody who's never lost anything to find out what it feels like. Reason two, a grudge, not against Bruce Lee specifically, but against the shape of a world where one man's parlor trick outshines another man's decade of real competition. Volunteer 3 was nothing like either of them. Freddie, 20 years old, a line cook with a fast mouth and 3 friends who'd bet him he wouldn't go through with it. One of them told me later, a bartender who overheard the whole wager recalled $20 and free beer for a month if I do it. I'm not scared of getting hit. I'm scared of what they'll say if I chicken out. Reason 3, a dare, and the particular terror of a young man who'd rather take a beating in public than a joke from his friends. Now, the fourth wasn't chasing money or revenge or a bet. He was chasing a feeling he thought he'd never get to feel again. Pop Whitlock was 58 years old, a retired boxer with flattened knuckles and a nose that had been broken often enough to have its own opinion about which direction a face should point. He'd read the notice pinned to a barbershop wall and stood in front of it for a full minute before writing his name down. I told the fellas signing us up, he said, and this comes from the son of man who was standing in line behind him that day. I know I'm not winning. Wasn't planning to win a fight in 20 years. I just want one more time walking into a room where anything could happen. You get old and rooms stop feeling like that. Reason 4, not money. Not a grudge, not a dare, just an old fighter's hunger for one more room where anything could happen. $512. That's roughly what the paper ended up paying out across all 10 volunteers by the time the night was through, though nobody kept perfectly clean books on it, and the number varies a little depending on who's telling you. What doesn't vary is how fast the list filled. Within 11 days, Kessler had his 10 names, and every single one of them had walked through that door for a reason that had almost nothing to do with Bruce Lee and everything to do with something happening in their own life that a Saturday night in a rented hall could somehow fix. Take the 5th volunteer. His name was Delgado, a construction foreman built like the buildings he put up, 41 years old with a 16-year-old son who'd stopped looking him in the eyes sometime around the boy's 15th birthday. A neighbor of Delgado's, a woman who watched his kids some evenings, remembered the conversation that decided it. His boy told him martial arts was a joke, that his father wouldn't last 10 seconds against a real fighter, she told me. Delgado didn't argue. He just signed up, told me, I don't need to win anything. I need my son in that room watching me try. Reason 5. Not pride for himself. Pride borrowed forward, aimed at a boy who'd stopped believing his father could surprise him. Then there was Nash, a used car salesman with a salesman's smile and a salesman's instinct for a stage, who signed up for reasons so shameless he didn't even bother disguising them. $20 is $20, he told a fellow volunteer while they waited to be signed in. But you know what's worth more than $20? Every customer in this city reading my name in the paper next to Bruce Lee's. Reason 6. Publicity, plain and unbothered by how it looked. 2 more rounded out the group before the week was out. A quiet locksmith named Choi told almost nobody why he'd come. He signed a list, paid his own way to the fitting for his volunteer number, and said only one sentence to the clerk who processed him, which she remembered precisely because it was so short. Somebody did something like this for me once a long time ago, and I never got to pay it back to him, so I'll pay it forward instead. Reason 7, a private debt, owed to a man nobody in that office ever learned the name of, settled by standing in for him. And then a gym owner named Ruth Cabrera, one of the only women in the county running her own self-defense classes, had a reason sharp enough to cut through every other motive on that list. I've got 11 women training with me, she told a student who asked her, point blank, why a respected instructor would volunteer to be a punching bag for a stranger's exhibition. Every one of them has been told, at some point in her life, that this isn't a room for her. I'm not going to sit in the crowd and watch 10 men prove a point about strength while every woman in this city wonders whether she'd have been allowed to try. If there's a spot on that list, I wanted to have my name on it. Reason 8, and arguably the sharpest one of the bunch. 8 volunteers, 8 reasons, and 8 people who, whatever else you want to say about them, were exactly what they claimed to be. Ordinary, untrained, or trained just enough to matter to no one but themselves. That left 2 spots. And here's where the story stops being simple. Picture the sign-up office on its last afternoon taking names. A cramped back room at the newspaper, a card table, a clerk with an ink-stained thumb checking names off a list. 2 men came in separately, about an hour apart, both perfectly calm, both perfectly ordinary looking, both with stories ready before anyone asked. The 9th volunteer gave his name as Vance. Mid-30s, average build, a canvas jacket that could have belonged to anybody who worked with his hands. He told the clerk he was a warehouse inspector, that he kept himself fit walking loading docks all day, that a buddy had shown him a classified ad and dared him over beers. It was a clean story. Nothing about it raised a single eyebrow. The 10th volunteer gave his name as Marsh. A little younger, a little broader through the shoulders, an easy smile that put people at ease before they'd even finished shaking his hand. He said he sold insurance, that he'd wrestled a little in college for fun, nothing serious, and that he mostly wanted to see Bruce Lee up close because his sister wouldn't stop talking about him. Nobody in that office had any reason to doubt either man. Why would they? A warehouse inspector and an insurance salesman signing up for $20 and a story to tell. That's not suspicious. That's Tuesday. The list was full. 10 names, 10 reasons, and a date now fixed 3 weeks out. Here's what gets me about that moment in the sign-up office. The ordinary calm of it, the ink-stained clerk closing the folder and moving on her next piece of paperwork. No idea, she just filed away the 2 names that would end up matching more than anyone else's on that list. That's the myth doing its work, quietly, before anybody's even noticed the story has a second layer. But we're not there yet. Add fear to the equation first. Bruce Lee's fear, specifically, because that's the part almost nobody tells honestly. Everybody wants to talk about the 10 volunteers. Almost nobody asks what it actually felt like 3 weeks out to be the one man who'd said yes to all of them at once. Bruce didn't sleep well the first week after that demonstration. A training partner from that period, the same wiry, stripe-counting student who'd watched Curtis pin him, remembered a conversation on a slow Tuesday night, the 2 of them sweeping the floor after class, that has stuck with him for the rest of his life. He said something to me I didn't understand until years later, the student told me. He said, "That reporter's question was a fair question. People think I should be angry at him for asking it. I'm not. He asked the only question worth asking. Can one man really handle 10? And the honest answer is no. Not the way people imagine it. 10 against 1 isn't a fight you win. It's a fight you survive, if you're lucky and if you're smart, and anyone who tells you different is selling you a movie, not martial arts." Sit with that for a second, because it matters more than almost anything else in this story. The most famous thing ever asked of Bruce Lee beat 10 men, and the man himself, privately, to almost nobody, admitted the honest math said he couldn't. Not cleanly, not the way the newspapers would want it drawn up. 10 against 1 is not a winnable proposition in any sense that a boxing scorecard would recognize, and Bruce knew that better than Charlie Voss ever could have, because Bruce was the one who'd actually have to stand in that room. Now, did Bruce Lee ever say those exact words on that exact Tuesday, sweeping that exact floor? Almost certainly not word for word. But stay with me, because the sentiment behind it is about as real as anything in this whole story gets. And here's how I know. The real Bruce Lee, years later, sat for a television interview up in Canada, and a host asked him something in roughly the same spirit, pushed him on how a man his size could possibly hold his own against bigger, tougher opponents. Bruce didn't puff his chest out and promise victory. He talked calmly, almost gently, about awareness, about distance, about the plain fact that the smartest way to win a fight against more than one man is to never be standing in the room with all of them in the first place. That's not legend. That's on the record, word for word, from the man himself. The philosophy in this story isn't invented. Only the room is. So when the newspaper's list came back with 10 names on it, and Charlie Voss carried it over to Bruce's school himself to make sure the arrangement was official, Bruce read through it once, agreed to the date, and asked exactly one question before he signed anything. "These are volunteers," he said. "Ordinary men. Nobody's bringing in a ringer." Charlie Voss looked him dead in the eye and told him no, of course not. Just 10 ordinary men who'd answered a classified ad. He believed it when he said it. That's the part worth sitting with. Charlie Voss wasn't lying to Bruce Lee's face. He simply didn't know yet that he was wrong. An hour before the doors opened that night, all 10 volunteers were shown into a small side room behind the stage to wait together, and it's worth pausing on that hour because it's the only point in this whole story where all 10 of them occupied the same space at the same time before any of it had happened to any of them. Sully sat by himself near the door, working his knuckles one at a time, the way a man does when he's trying to look calmer than he is. Ortiz paced. Freddie talked too much, too fast, to anyone who'd listen, and Pop Whitlock finally told him, not unkindly, to sit down and save his breath for the mat. Delgado kept checking his watch, thinking about the third row where his son would be sitting. Nash worked the room like it was a used car lot, shaking every hand twice. Choi sat in the corner and said almost nothing to anyone, which nobody in that room found strange, because he hadn't said much to anybody the entire 3 weeks. Ruth Cabrera stood near the mirror, going through the same wrist lock sequence she'd run 1,000 times in her own gym, lips moving silently through the count. Vance and Marsh sat together, near the back, talking quietly and easily, the way two men do when they've actually trained together for 2 weeks and everyone around them assumes they only just met that afternoon. Nobody thought anything of it. Why would they? 10 strangers waiting their turn. Of course, some of them would find something to talk about. We didn't know each other from anywhere, Ruth Cabrera said years later, except that room, that hour waiting. And I remember thinking, looking around at all of us, the boxer, the cook, the salesman, the 2 quiet ones in the back, that we were about as unlikely a group of people to have anything in common as you could put in one room. Except we all had a reason. Every single one of us. I just didn't know yet that 2 of the reasons in that room were lies. 3 weeks later, the rented hall was bigger than the one from the original demonstration. Kessler had made sure of that, had gone looking for a room that could hold close to 600 people once word got around, and word had gotten around plenty. By the night of the event, every folding chair in that building was full, and a second ring of spectators stood 3 deep along the back wall, craning for a view over each other's shoulders. The rules, such as they were, had been agreed on in advance and read aloud before anything started. Each volunteer would face Bruce Lee one at a time, no weapons, 2 minutes on the clock per man. A volunteer won his round if he put Bruce on the ground and kept him there for a 3 count, or if he simply lasted the full 2 minutes without being controlled or forced to submit. Bruce went around the moment a volunteer tapped, went down and stayed down, or the 2 minutes ran out with Bruce clearly and safely in command. It was on paper a demonstration. In practice, 400 strangers packed in a folding chairs made it feel like something closer to a public trial. Sully went first, the longshoreman, forearms like ship's rope, the man who needed groceries for 2 weeks. He came in low and heavy, exactly the way you'd expect from a man used to muscling crates around all day. Bruce let him close the distance, stepped a half turn to the outside instead of backing straight up, and caught the momentum of Sully's own charge, redirecting it downward with almost no force of his own added to it. Sully hit the mat on his side, more surprised than hurt, and stayed down for the count. 11 seconds, start to finish. "I've moved crates heavier than any man alive," Sully told a reporter afterward, laughing at his own words from 3 weeks earlier. Turns out that's not the same thing as fighting one. Ortiz went next, and he lasted longer. His judo instincts were real, and for about 20 seconds it actually looked competitive, both men trading grips, testing balance. But Bruce's footwork kept finding angles Ortiz's training hadn't accounted for, and eventually a foot sweep put him down clean. Ortiz got up laughing, of all things, and shook Bruce's hand without being asked to. "I came and wanted to prove a point about my own career," he said later. "I walked out just glad I got a feel for 20 seconds like I was actually in a real contest with somebody that good. That's worth more than the trophy I never won." Freddie lasted less than 10 seconds and spent the walk back to his seat grinning ear to ear, already composing the story he'd tell his friends at the bar for the rest of his life. Pop Whitlock, the old boxer, got the loudest ovation of the night for simply staying on his feet the full 2 minutes, dodging and covering with the patient economy of a man who'd learned 30 years ago that surviving a round is its own kind of victory. Delgado lasted almost as long, his son watching from the third row the entire time, eyes wide, and when Delgado finally went down, he looked straight at the boy before he even looked at Bruce. Nash got exactly the headline he wanted and nothing more, down in under 15 seconds, but grinning through the whole thing like a man who'd already spent the newspaper money in his head. Choi's turn was quiet, almost gentle, the two men moving through it like a private conversation nobody else in the hall was invited to. Ruth Cabrera went last of the 8, and she was the one round the crowd actually leaned forward for. Setup. She came in with her hands lower than the men before her, weight forward on the balls of her feet, watching Bruce's hips instead of his hands, the way she taught her own students to read a bigger opponent. Technique. She went for a wrist lock the instant Bruce reached for her sleeve, a clean, practice motion that would have ended the round against almost anyone who telegraphed a grab the way most of that night's volunteers had. Biomechanics, but Bruce hadn't reached for her sleeve carelessly. He'd offered it, watching for exactly that response. And the moment her grip closed, he rotated his whole forearm through the weak point of her lock instead of fighting its strength, turning her own leverage back into the wrist she'd used to build it. Reaction. She felt it go the instant before it happened and adjusted, stepping in rather than away, buying herself another 4 or 5 seconds before the angle finally beat her. Observation. She lasted longer doing it right than 6 men before her lasted doing it wrong. A fellow instructor sitting near the front told a local paper years afterward. And when Bruce brought her down, he did it the way you'd set down something you didn't want to break. The room went silent in a different way than it had for anyone else that night. The silence of watching something land exactly the way it was supposed to. 8 down. 8 ordinary people. 8 distinct reasons for walking into that hall, and 8 rounds that had gone more or less the way anyone paying close attention to Bruce Lee's reputation would have predicted. Total time on the clock for all 8 combined, just under 4 minutes. Flip it around now, because the crowd certainly did. By the 8th round, the mood in that hall had shifted from tension to something closer to celebration. People were laughing, applauding each fall, treating the whole evening as exactly the demonstration it had been advertised as. Charlie Voss, sitting in the second row with his notebook, had already started drafting the piece in his head. A clean story, a confirmed legend. 10 volunteers, 8 down without much trouble, and 2 left to go. Then Vance stood up. He walked to the center of the hall with the same easy, unhurried posture he'd carried since the sign-up office. The warehouse inspector, the man who kept fit walking loading docks. But something in the way he set his feet made the first few rows go quiet before Bruce had even raised his hands. It wasn't a stance a warehouse inspector picks up walking loading docks. It was a stance somebody drills into you thousands of times until your body stops thinking about it. Bruce noticed. You could see it, the smallest flicker of recalibration behind his eyes, the look of a man doing new math in real time. Vance closed distance clean and fast, slipped Bruce's first probing jab with the economy of movement no warehouse inspector on earth has ever needed to develop, and drove a shoulder into Bruce's ribs that put actual weight behind it. Real weight, trained weight, not the desperate lunging weight of a man who'd never done this before. For the first time all night, Bruce had to give ground. 2 down became a very different phrase than 8 down had been. I remember the whole tone of the room changing in about 4 seconds. A spectator in the third row told me years later. Everybody had been laughing a minute earlier. Then this man moved like he'd done it in real fights before, and it got so quiet you could hear the folding chairs creak. And then, before the first round with Vance had even finished, Marsh, the insurance salesman, the friendly smile, the sister who wouldn't stop talking about Bruce Lee, stood up from his seat near the aisle, and something in the way he cracked his knuckles told at least one witness in the front row exactly what was coming. 2 men who lied about who they were, that witness said. That's the moment I understood we hadn't actually seen 10 ordinary volunteers that night. We'd seen 8 of them, and 2 of something else entirely. One more variable now, and it's the one that changes everything that comes after. Somebody put those 2 men on that list. Somebody paid for it, arranged it, and made sure neither Bruce Lee nor Charlie Voss ever saw it coming. That somebody was Walter Kessler. It came out slowly, in pieces, over the years. A bookkeeper who'd handled the paper's accounts mentioning an unusual cash withdrawal the week before the event. A fixer named Duke Ellery who worked the fight scene downtown and who, decades later, admitted to a much younger reporter that he'd once been paid a flat fee to find two men who could actually go the distance for a demonstration Kessler wanted to make sure produced a real result. Vance, it turned out, had spent 6 years teaching hand-to-hand combat before an injury ended that career early. Marsh fought, unlicensed, in back rooms and warehouse rings around the docks. The kind of fighting nobody's paper ever wrote up because nobody involved wanted their name in print. Here's the factor nobody accounted for going in. Kessler hadn't sent Charlie Voss to that Chinatown demonstration hoping for a fair fight. He'd sent him hoping for a headline, and 8 ordinary volunteers going down clean in under 4 minutes combined was not, in Kessler's private math, a headline. It was a shrug. He needed at least one round where the outcome wasn't a foregone conclusion, and he wasn't willing to leave that to chance, or to 8 strangers who'd answered a classified ad for $20. He told me once, years after the fact, half drunk and half proud of it, a former employee of Kessler's paper told me, that he didn't think of it as cheating. He thought of it as making sure the story was worth telling. His exact words, as best I remember them, a demonstration where the outcome's never in doubt isn't news. I just made sure it was news. That's who arranged it, and that's why. Not malice toward Bruce Lee specifically. Kessler barely knew the man, had met him exactly once, briefly, to confirm the date. Just a publisher's cold arithmetic, the same arithmetic that put a provocative question in Charlie Voss's mouth 3 weeks earlier. A good story sells papers, and a great story sells more of them. And Walter Kessler had decided, unilaterally, without asking anyone in that hall for permission, to manufacture the difference between good and great. Charlie Voss didn't know. That's the detail that matters most going forward, and it's worth being honest about, because it would be a much simpler story if the reporter had been in on it from the start. He wasn't. He was sitting in the second row with his notebook, watching 2 strangers stand up out of a lineup he'd helped assemble, feeling the exact same cold drop in his stomach that 400 other people in that hall were feeling. The sense that something he'd trusted had just quietly, invisibly stopped being what it claimed to be. He'd find out the truth about Kessler's arrangement eventually. Not that night. That night, all he could do, all anyone in that hall could do was watch. Vance's round had already started, and it did not look like the 8 that came before it. Set up first, Vance kept a low, patient guard, weight centered, feet never crossing, the exact opposite of the eager, off-balance rushes Bruce had spent the whole evening redirecting with almost no effort. He wasn't trying to overwhelm Bruce. He was trying to wait him out, to make Bruce commit first, the way a man trained to fight other trained men learns to do. Bruce adjusted his own stance the moment he registered it. Weight lower, hands closer to center, the loose showman's economy of the earlier rounds gone entirely. Technique. Vance closed in 3 controlled steps, feinted high, and drove for a double-leg takedown low and fast. A wrestler shot, textbook, the kind of thing that ends fights against people who've never faced it before. Bruce sprawled his hips back and drove a forearm down across the back of Vance's neck, the classic answer to that exact attack. But Vance had faced that answer 100 times in training himself, and he adjusted mid-motion, converting the stalled takedown into a clinch, both men's shoulders locked together, feet scrabbling for grip on a mat suddenly slick with sweat. Biomechanics. Here's why that mattered. Bruce's whole game all night had been managing distance, staying just outside the range where a bigger, stronger opponent's raw power could operate, using footwork and timing instead of matching force with force. Vance's entire strategy erased that distance immediately and refused to let it reopen. Up close, weight against weight, Some of Bruce's advantages simply stopped counting the way they had all evening. Reaction. For the first time that night, Bruce's breathing changed, audibly from the front rows, a sharper exhale through the nose instead of the calm, controlled breath he'd shown all evening. He broke the clinch with an elbow strike that connected clean against Vance's ribs, and Vance staggered half a step, but didn't go down and didn't stop coming. Observation. I've watched 100 demonstrations in my life. A martial arts instructor sitting 3 rows back told a colleague afterward, in words that colleague repeated to me almost exactly. And that was the first time all night I saw Bruce Lee's face do something other than look completely certain. Just for a second. Just enough that everybody near me noticed it too. The 2-minute round ended with neither man down. The first tie of the night, and the loudest ovation yet, though it was a different kind of noise than before. Less delight, more disbelief. In the gap between rounds, Bruce toweled off his neck and drank water from a paper cup someone passed him from the front row, and for close to a minute the entire hall simply watched him breathe, the way you watch a boxer's corner between rounds, looking for a tell, for any sign of how much of what just happened had actually cost him. He gave them almost nothing. A slight roll of the shoulder. A longer exhale than the one before it. But almost nothing is not the same as nothing, and the front rows knew the difference. Marsh came up next, and if anything, he was worse for Bruce than Vance had been. Not because he was more skilled, but because he fought dirty in a specific, practiced way that only comes from unlicensed backroom rings where nobody's enforcing rules that matter. You can always tell a man who's fought in a real ring with no referee. A boxing trainer who'd watched from the second row told a magazine years afterward, in words a colleague of his later repeated to me almost verbatim. Licensed fighters flinch away from certain things because they've been trained out of them. Marsh didn't flinch away from anything. That's not talent. That's a man who's been hurt enough in rooms with no rules that the rules stopped meaning anything to his body. He led with a low kick to the outside of Bruce's knee, something none of the 8 ordinary volunteers had thought to try, buckling Bruce's stance for a half second that Marsh used to close distance and get both hands on Bruce's collar. What happened next is the part witnesses still argue about, decades on, the exact sequence, who had control of what, for how long. But everyone agrees on the shape of it. Marsh got Bruce off balance, drove him back 3 full steps toward the edge of the mat, and for close to 8 seconds, an eternity in a fight that had been ending in single digits all night, had a genuine grip on him that Bruce had to actively, visibly fight to break. 8 seconds. That's not a long time to read about. It is an extremely long time to watch happen to a man the whole room had just spent an hour believing was unbeatable. Now, here's what gets me about this part of the story, and I say this having heard maybe a dozen different versions of exactly how those 8 seconds went. Every single version, no matter who's telling it, includes the same detail. The room went completely silent. Not tense quiet, the way it had been for Vance's round. Actually silent. 400 people, and according to at least 3 separate witnesses, you could hear the mat. Bruce broke the grip. He always broke the grip. Every version of the story agrees on that too, eventually. But it cost him something to do it, and for the first time all night, everyone in that hall could see the cost on his face. That's the theory of a 10-man exhibition. Here's the practice of it, because the 2 men didn't stop there. Marsh and Vance, it turned out, hadn't just been recruited separately. They knew each other. Duke Ellery had trained them together for the better part of 2 weeks, and whatever the printed rules said about facing volunteers one at a time, the 2 of them had privately agreed, without saying a word to Charlie Voss or anyone running the event, that Vance's round would end the moment Marsh's began, so that Bruce would face the second man already breathing hard from the first. Nobody had planned for that either. It was one more condition, quietly broken, on top of all the others. Marsh's second attempt came fast, before Bruce had fully reset his footing a low shot to the same knee he'd struck before, forcing Bruce's weight backward off his center for just long enough that Marsh got both arms around Bruce's waist and drove him hard off his feet. Bruce went down, actually down. His back and shoulder hit the mat with a sound the front rows heard clearly. No cushioning grace to it. Nothing like the controlled falls he'd been engineering for 8 volunteers all evening. For nearly 2 full seconds, Marsh had top position on a man the entire hall had spent the night believing could not be taken to the floor at all. I've told this part of the story 100 times. Pop Whitlock, the old boxer, still in his seat from his own round earlier that night, said years later, and people always ask if I'm exaggerating. I'm not. That whole hall stood up out of their chairs at once. 600 people standing and not one of them making a sound. 3 rows from the front, Walter Kessler did not stand up with the rest of the hall. He stayed exactly where he was, according to the printer's apprentice, sitting near enough to watch him, leaning forward with both hands braced on his knees, wearing the specific private satisfaction of a man watching an investment finally pay off. He hadn't come for a fair demonstration. He'd come for precisely this, a moment nobody in that hall would forget, a photograph-worthy collapse, a story too good to bury on an inside page. Whatever happened to Bruce Lee in the next 5 seconds, Kessler had already decided, sitting there with his cigar unlit between 2 fingers, that his investment had paid for itself twice over. Here's what happened next, as close as any version of a legend agrees on it. Bruce didn't panic. That's the detail every account holds on to, because it's the one detail that connects directly back to 3 weeks of a stocky brown belt named Curtis Boyle pinning him to a practice floor on purpose, night after night, until his body had stopped treating a bad position like an emergency. He used the very same instinct he'd drilled into himself in that back room above the herbalist shop. Hips rolling, one arm trapping Marsh's wrist against his own body, using Marsh's forward momentum against the floor instead of against Bruce. And in under 3 seconds, he'd reversed the position entirely, ending with Marsh's arm extended and controlled, Bruce's knee across his chest. Marsh's own shoulder screaming for relief that Bruce chose, very deliberately, not to take from him. That's the reversal. That's not, however, where this part of the story ends, because Bruce Lee, with total control of a man who'd broken the agreed rules twice in 5 minutes and had genuinely put him on his back in front of 600 people, had a choice in front of him that mattered more than the takedown itself. He could have taken the shoulder. Everyone in that hall who understood what they were looking at knew it. A small tear of the wrist, maybe 2 more pounds of pressure, and Marsh would have tapped the mat so hard it would have echoed. Nobody would have blamed him. The man had lied about who he was, had broken the round order, had put Bruce on his back in front of 600 witnesses using training he'd sworn on a clipboard he didn't have. A finish like that wouldn't have been cruelty. It would have been arithmetic, the same arithmetic Bruce had done 3 weeks earlier in an empty practice room. This is what happens to men who cheat. He let go instead. Not slowly, not for show. He simply released the hold, stepped back a full pace, and put both open hands up in the universal, unmistakable gesture for stop. The 2-minute clock still had time on it. The room, by every account, took a full second to understand what it was looking at, because it did not look like victory. It looked like a man walking away from one. "Get up," Bruce said to Marsh, loud enough that the first 10 rows heard it clearly. "We're done here." Marsh got up slowly, rubbing his shoulder, saying nothing. Vance, still standing at the edge of the mat from his own round, didn't move either. And here's the detail worth sitting with, the one almost every witness mentions independently of the others. Neither man argued. Neither man tried to claim the round, or protest that time hadn't run out, or demand a rematch. 2 men who'd been paid to manufacture a real fight had just gotten one, and something about the way it ended took the fight straight out of both of them. Charlie Voss, from the second row, stood up out of his chair without fully realizing he'd done it. He told a colleague afterward that his exact thought word for word, was, "This isn't the ending I came here to write down." Bruce turned to face the hall. Not Kessler specifically. Not yet, though Kessler was there that night, 3 rows from the front, watching his fixers, 2 hired men stand in the center of a demonstration that had just stopped going the way he'd paid for it to go. Bruce addressed the whole room instead. "Somebody asked me a few weeks ago if I could beat 10 men, he said. "That's a fair question. I want to answer it honestly, because I think the honest answer matters more than the exciting one." The hall went quiet in the way 600 people go quiet when they sense the actual point of the evening is finally arriving. 10 against 1 isn't a fight anybody wins clean, Bruce went on. Not me. Not anybody. If 2 of you had come at me with the intention of really hurting me, and I'd matched that intention, one of us would be leaving this hall on a stretcher, and it might have been either of us. That's not skill winning. That's luck deciding, and I don't perform for luck. He looked, finally, at Marsh, whose shoulder was still hanging awkwardly from where Bruce had held it a moment earlier. "So here's my answer," Bruce said. "You want to know what I can do against 10 men? This is it. Not what I just did to him." He nodded at Marsh. "What I chose not to do." Here's what gets me about that line, and I've turned it over more than any other piece of this story. It's not a boast. It doesn't even sound like an answer, not the way the question was asked. But it is one, maybe the only honest one that question ever had. He didn't say, "I could have beaten 10 men. He said, "I can choose, even when it stops being fair, even when somebody's lied to my face and put me on my back in front of 600 strangers, not to become the thing the moment was daring me to become." That's the myth doing its work, if you want to call it that. Or it's just a 27-year-old man, breathing hard, shoulder aching from a fall nobody in that hall will ever forget, deciding in real time what kind of story he wanted this to be. Vance was the first to say anything. He crossed the mat, stuck out his hand. Not a fighter's handshake, careful and testing, but a plain, open one, and said something that a spectator in the front row overheard clearly enough to repeat for years afterward. "I've trained men for 6 years, Vance said. "I've never once seen somebody let go a finish that clean. I came in here to see if you were real. I didn't expect to leave believing something else entirely." Marsh, still favoring the shoulder, didn't say much, but he stayed after the hall emptied, waited by the side door until Bruce came out and offered an apology that nobody had asked him for. "I fight dirty because that's the only kind of fighting anybody ever paid me for," he told Bruce, according to the doorman who let both of them out that night. "Tonight's the first time dirty didn't get me anything. I don't know what to do with that yet." Neither man ever fought Bruce Lee again, and neither man, as far as anyone was able to track down years later, ever spoke badly of that night to a single soul. Respect, grudging and hard-won, is not the ending anybody expected walking into that hall. It's the one they got. The 8 ordinary volunteers had their own endings, smaller but no less real. Sully's $20 bought 2 weeks of groceries and, according to his daughter, a story he told at every family dinner for the rest of his life, usually right before dessert. Ortiz went back to teaching judo the following month with a new humility in his classes that his own students noticed and never quite understood the source of. Freddie's friends bought him beer for exactly 1 month, as promised, and then, according to Freddie, conveniently forgot the deal existed, which he found funnier than the whole fight itself. Pop Whitlock got his one more room where anything could happen, and by his own account, it was worth every bruise. Delgado's son, the neighbor told me, didn't say much on the walk home that night, but he sat closer to his father in the car than he had in over a year, and that, for Delgado, was the entire $20 worth of the evening and then some. Nash got his name in the paper exactly as promised, right below a headline he hadn't written and didn't expect. Choi paid his debt forward and went back to being a locksmith nobody in that city ever heard mention again in connection with Bruce Lee. And Ruth Cabrera walked back into her own gym the following Monday, to 11 students who'd all read about her in the paper, and who, for the first time, several of them told her, walked in that morning standing a little straighter. 10 volunteers, 10 reasons, and by the end of the night, 10 people who'd gotten something out of that haul that had almost nothing to do with the $20 and almost everything to do with why they'd actually shown up in the first place. Which leaves one person's ending unaccounted for, Charlie Voss. He didn't go home that night. Witnesses remember him standing near the emptying hall for close to an hour after the crowd had cleared, notebook still in his hand, mostly unused. He'd stopped taking notes somewhere around Marsh's second takedown, too caught up in watching to write any of it down. Kessler found him there, still buzzing with the electricity of having just watched something he hadn't planned for, already talking about the piece. Ringers, Kessler said, according to a printer's apprentice who happened to be nearby locking up for the night. 2 ringers, and he still let go of the finish. That's your headline, kid. Bruce Lee outsmarts the fix. Write it up big. And here's where the story stops being about a martial artist and a stunt question and becomes, for a few paragraphs, about a young reporter finding out exactly how much of his own integrity he'd been willing to spend on somebody else's assignment. Because Charlie Voss already knew, by then, something Kessler hadn't told him outright, but that added up the moment he thought about it clearly. The cash withdrawal he'd overheard mentioned in passing weeks earlier. The 2 men who knew each other a little too well backstage. The ease with which Kessler was already spinning the fix into a triumphant headline instead of the scandal it actually was. Kessler wasn't horrified that 2 ringers had been smuggled into a fair demonstration. He was thrilled. It made better copy either way. And that Charlie understood standing in that emptying hall was the entire and complete extent of what Walter Kessler had ever cared about. The next morning, Kessler had the front page already sketched out on a legal pad when Charlie came in, a headline built entirely around the ringers, around the fix, around Bruce Lee's supposed unbeatable feat, somehow made even more impressive by the reveal of secret professional opponents. It was by every measure Kessler used to measure anything a great story. Sensational. Guaranteed to sell out the morning run twice over. Charlie Voss looked at that legal pad for a long moment. Then he told his publisher he wasn't writing that story. Here's the part almost nobody expected, including, by his own later admission, Charlie himself. He didn't quit. He didn't storm out. He sat down at his own desk, and for most of that day, wrote a piece that led with none of what Kessler wanted led with. He opened, instead, with the moment Bruce let go of Marsh's arm. He wrote about 10 volunteers and 10 separate human reasons for standing in that hall, tracking down as many of their stories as he could reach by telephone that same afternoon. Sully's sick wife, Delgado's son in the 3rd row, Ruth Cabrera's 11 students. He mentioned the ringers plainly, without hiding it, but he didn't lead with the scandal of it. He led with the choice a 27-year-old man had made in the middle 30 seconds after being lied to and thrown to a mat in front of 600 strangers. Kessler read the finished draft and, according to that same printer's apprentice, went quiet for a full minute before saying only, "It won't sell as many copies." He ran it anyway, whether out of some flicker of conscience or simply because the deadline had already passed and there wasn't time to argue Charlie into rewriting it. Nobody who was in that office that day agrees on for certain. It didn't sell as many copies as Kessler's version would have. Charlie Voss's editor told him as much within the week, more than once. But it's the version that got clipped out of the paper, folded, and kept in Ruth Cabrera's gym for a decade, in Delgado's wallet until the day he died, in a scrapbook belonging to a woman who'd watched a locksmith named Choi quietly pay forward a debt he never explained to anyone else. It's the version that outlived the one Kessler actually wanted. That's not a small thing, and I don't think it's an accident either. A young reporter who'd spent 3 weeks asking a provocative question on somebody else's orders, standing at the end of the story with a choice of his own to make, and choosing, in his own smaller and less dramatic way, the same thing Bruce Lee had chosen in that hall. Not the version that wins the most attention, the version that's actually true. Two men on the same night deciding not to take the easier finish. That's the part of this whole legend that I think about longer than any punch or takedown in it. I think about the 10 of them more than I think about Bruce Lee, if I'm honest with you. A dock worker with a sick wife. A judoka nursing a grudge nobody but him could see. A cook who couldn't stand his friends' laughter more than he feared getting hit. An old boxer chasing one more room where anything could happen. A foreman who needed his son to watch him try. A salesman who wanted his name in print. A locksmith paying off a debt he never explained. A woman who wanted every student of hers to know the room had space for her too. And two men who lied about all of it and left, by every account, different than they arrived. 10 reasons, and not one of them was really about Bruce Lee at all. That might be the actual answer to the reporter's question, buried under all the rest of it. You don't find out what a man's made of by watching him fight. You find out by watching who shows up to test him and why. So, how much of that actually happened? Honestly, almost none of it, at least not the way I've just told it to you. I can't point you to a hall that held 600 people on a specific night in a specific year and prove 10 names signed a specific list. I can't produce Charlie Voss's original draft or Kessler's legal pad or a photograph of Vance shaking Bruce Lee's hand by the side door. This is a legend, a story I tell, dramatized and largely imagined, inspired by the real Bruce Lee, not a record of him. Nobody should walk away from this thinking they've just heard a documented piece of history. They haven't. But here's what I'd stand behind if you push me on it. The real Bruce Lee really did get asked provocative, trap-shaped questions by reporters more than once in his life, and more than once, he really did answer them sideways instead of head-on, redirecting instead of performing, choosing the honest, complicated answer over the exciting, simple one. That much is on the record. And his actual, real philosophy about facing more than one opponent was never, I would destroy them all. It was closer to what this story tries to get at in its own invented way, that the smartest victory in a fight like that is arranging your whole life so you're never standing in that room in the first place. And if you do, end up standing in it. The measure of the man isn't how many people he can put down. It's what he refuses to become while he's doing it. That part, I'd bet my life, is real. Everything around it, the 10 volunteers, the reporter, the ringers, the hall, is mine. I built it to get at something true using a man who never actually lived through it. That's the deal this whole channel makes with you, every time, and I'd rather you know it than believe something that never happened. Some men become legends because of what they did. Bruce became one because of what he chose not to do. Until the next legend. If this one got you, there are more legends where this came from. Subscribe, and I'll keep telling them.